Okay, so let's start here with looking at larger and more, or not larger, but sort of smaller, narrower, more specific patterns of evolution. And what we see here are a bunch of anoles, which are a type of lizard. And one thing they have in common, I think, is this kind of bone that comes out and creates this frill, which is, they probably evolved that for attracting mates, I think is the primary reason. And here you can see a bunch of different types of anoles. And even though they're all anoles, they're not the same species because of some of the different patterns of evolution that take place as they split off from some kind of anole ancestor and eventually evolved into their own types of anoles. And when they split off, that's called divergent evolution. So to diverge means to split. And this can also be referred to as adaptive radiation, but I prefer the term divergent evolution because it more implies that splitting off of a common ancestor, which can be illustrated in a cladogram. So this one is like extremely broad. It's going from like an amoeba to basically a lot of different organisms. So this one is a little maybe inaccurate in some ways and also kind of super broad. Actually, the amoeba should only go to the animals, but as you can see, it's actually going to the plants. So that's one mistake there. But anyway, divergent evolution is the kind that most people think of, that things are kind of branching off of each other and changing into new forms and new species. So over here we have organisms evolved from a common ancestor into a variety of forms that live in different niches. And we could draw these with cladograms. So we can have a cladogram that's specifically just for fish or for frogs or for horses or for primates or for dragonflies. And they would all be different, like divergent evolution cladograms on some level. So sometimes the term adaptive radiation comes up. Radiate means to spread out. And that's often drawn when you draw like a sun. Like in a drawing, and you have like the different radiation lines coming off. That's the radiation, meaning kind of spreading out or going in different directions. And then the adaptive part of that comes from that they're radiating out into different niches with different adaptations. But when you illustrate it, it kind of looks more like this, which I don't think is quite as useful or as accurate as the branching style. But here we see it kind of radiating in different directions. These are a bunch of different types of finches that I believe Darwin studied in the Galapagos Islands that had radiated out into these different islands with different adaptations for survival. And a lot of what he noticed were different colors, maybe for camouflage, but in particular he really studied their beaks, and that their beaks were designed for eating different types of food in their niche. And so here we see in the yellow bar, different thing, or in the center circle of the radiation, eating fruit, insects, cactus, seeds, and so different adaptations for eating different types of food within their niche could be drawn like this as an adaptive radiation image. When we think of adaptive radiation or divergent evolution, we can actually use photos of modern species. And here we see different types of pocket mice and different types of fence lizards that are all, I think it's like one national park or something that has a bunch of different habitats, including sand dunes and grasslands and lava fields. And as their ancestors, showed up in these different habitats, or maybe the habitats changed around them over time, the different fence lizards and pocket mice evolved in different ways. And in particular, I think what they're focusing on here is camouflage, as they adapted and evolved through natural selection for these different sort of microhabitats within this maybe larger park and area. And so the ones that evolved into more of like the sandy dunes type of environments evolved the lighter type of camouflage, as we see with the two up here. And then when they evolved in the grasslands, something a little darker, and or maybe even a little more orange and yellowish for hiding in these grasses. And then the ones that moved and started to evolve into the lava fields evolved a darker color. And it's basically all about probably more able to hide from predators, but also sneak up on their prey in the case of the lizards. And But this is where predators are a big part of natural selection. If they can't see you, they're not going to eat you. They'll eat the other ones. And over time, the fence lizards and pocket mice evolved into these different colors based on these different habitats within their niche. And we could even look at like adaptive radiation with things like Pokemon, which is, just kind of a fun way to look at it, where EVs, for instance, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, can go through adaptive radiation into these different types of Pokemon. And we could even say maybe it's based on their different niche conditions, like this one is in the water and this one is in a darker habitat so it can hide, and this one's in a habitat with more leaves so it can hide, or this one's in a habitat with more ice and has different adaptations for that, and so on. And the evidence for divergent evolution comes from homologous structures and our study of genetics. So what we've talked about homologous structures before, where we basically, homo in this case means the same, and we can see that basically different organisms have the same bones. They just might be in different shapes and sizes based on how they've adapted and evolved into their niche. And so, for instance, it is believed that the ancestor of all mammals has what they're calling here a pentadactyl limb, as the ancestral terrestrial vertebrates limb plan. And then it says subsequently adapted by modification for different uses and habitats. And so if we look back at the ancestors of mammals, it is reptiles, and reptiles also have the pentadactyl limb, penta meaning 5, dactyl meaning fingers or toes. And if we look at lizards and crocodiles and all sorts of different reptiles, they have the pentadactyl setup as well. And so since they are believed to be the ancestors of mammals, mammals also have it almost across the board, even in things like bats, where we have all the bones in the wings here, or dolphins that have the 5 fingers in their fins, including whales. Even anteaters, they have kind of a weird hand, and moles, we see the pentadactyl design. We start to lose that in certain animals like the horses, but we've talked about that before, that there's bones back here that represent some of those fingers, and that the middle toe has become what we call the hoof. And we see this even in modern pigs, where they've got a couple toes up front, and they think it's like our fingers 3 and 4, I guess 3 being the middle, and 2 and 5 are kind of tucked back, and it's all still sort of new variations of the pentadactyl design. And also our study of genetics. So basically when we do genetic research, the more similar the organism's DNA is, the more related they are through divergent evolution. And so in the case of humans and chimpanzees, we are 99.8% the same, and then gorillas are 99.6%, and then orangutans are like 98 point something the same. And we can actually start to create like a divergent evolution chart or cladogram based on how similar our genetics are, as well as our homologous structures. But the genetics is really the one that's like really bringing it together. Okay, then we also have what's called convergent evolution, which is the evolution of organisms that don't share a direct ancestor, but do have similar traits due to evolving into a similar niche. So in this case, their ancestor is not the same, but they're converging, which is kind of like coming together on a very similar body design. And that's because they've evolved into a similar niche. So in the case of these organisms, they've evolved to move through the water. And what we have here is a fish, a reptile, this is a dinosaur, a mammal, and a bird. And what we see is they all have similar adaptations for survival. They did not all come from one swimming ancestor. So it's not like one type of fish evolved into all 4 of these things directly. Because we know mammals came out onto land, reptiles came out onto land, and obviously birds came out onto land. So their ancestors were land animals that had definite limbs for walking, and we've talked about dolphin and whale evolution already, even just in this set of notes. But obviously birds' ancestors were flying, they weren't swimming birds originally. So over time, because they started to live and exist in a water niche, if you have kind of a more bullet-shaped body and your limbs are sort of more fin-like, you have certain advantages for getting food, not getting eaten, stuff I've talked about before that can lead to what we call fitness. And if you have greater fitness, you're going to survive and reproduce better. And over time, a species might change in the direction of more and more specialized fitness. And in this case, we even see birds over time have evolved to have fins. And penguins obviously cannot fly, but they're incredibly good at swimming and very quick in the water. And their front limbs are no longer wings, but are more like a shark fin or a ichthyosaur fin or a dolphin fin. And we see different, adaptations due to convergent evolution. And and when we look at anteater species, it's believed they did not all come from one anteater ancestor, and especially the echidnas, because they have a pouch and are a marsupial, and none of the others are. And we see they're very separated. North America, we get the armadillo. South America, the giant anteater. We get the aardvark in Africa. We get the pangolin in China. So it's very spread out. And it is not believed that they all come from one common ancestor, but they evolved these similarities due to convergent evolution, because in their niche, they had to eat these bugs, and that was a big advantage. So what they all tend to have big claws for tearing into the ant hills and termite mounds. They'll have long snouts for kind of sticking in there, and long tongues for licking up the ants and termites. They also tend to have a protective covering, whether it's like armor or thicker skin or spikes in this case, that will protect them from insect bites, as the termites and the ants protect their colonies. And so we see all these very similar adaptations through convergent evolution, because in the niche of eating insects of this type, these are all helpful adaptations, and natural selection over time has molded these organisms into these shapes and designs with these different adaptations and features. And the evidence for this are called analogous structures. So I just went over a bunch with the anteaters, like the snouts and the thicker hide and the long tongues and the claws. Those would all be analogous structures. So I've talked about analogous structures before, like for instance, wings are a type of analogous structure that are helpful for survival. Birds did not evolve. Birds and bats did not evolve from the flying dinosaurs. So all three of these animals do not share one common ancestor, but have evolved these wings because it served an advantage for survival in their niche. I've talked about before, I think wings evolved for escape originally, and then became more for traveling or finding food and things like that. But wings are a famous type of analogous structure. And again, in the case of our anteaters, we've got the snouts, we've got the thicker skin or armor, the tongues, the claws, different things like that, as well as senses and stuff that help them find the ants and bugs. All right, we'll start with coevolution in the next video.